This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. In Congress, Wednesday, June 14, 1775, resolved that 6 companies of expert riflemen be immediately raised in Pennsylvania, 2 in Maryland, and 2 in Virginia, that each company consist of a captain, 3 lieutenants, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, a drummer or trumpeter, and 68 privates. That each company, as soon as completed, shall march and join the army near Boston, to be there employed as light infantry, under the command of the chief officer in that army. That the form of the enlistment be in the following words: I have this day voluntarily enlisted myself as a soldier in the American Continental Army for 1 year unless sooner discharged. And I do bind myself to conform, in all instances, to such rules and regulations as are, or shall be, established for the government of said army. On April 19, 1775, what would become known as the American War for Independence officially commenced with the battles at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. 3 days before the next major battle at Bunker Hill on June 17, the Second Continental Congress created the Continental Army. Over the course of the American Revolutionary War, it's estimated that about 230,000 men served in the Continental Army, with an additional 145,000 men who served in state militia units. What motivated these men who served to take up arms and join the army? Why did some men choose to fight in state militia units rather than in units of the main Continental Army? And what was the experience of these men like during their military service in the American War for Independence?
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
What motivated American men to take up arms and join the new American Army? This is an important question. But before we can answer it, we should explore how early American men understood military service and what their experiences with and in the military were like before the Revolution. Because American men did serve in military units throughout the colonial period. In fact, in addition to lots of fighting with Native Americans and even with their fellow colonists over land, American men served in 4 wars for empire prior to the Revolutionary War. Here in North America, we know these wars as King William's War, 1688 to 1697, Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, King George's War, 1744 to 1748, and the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. In Europe, they happen to know these same wars by different names. the 9 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, and the 7 Years' War. Given that many officers who served in the American War for Independence gained their military experience in the French and Indian War, we should start our exploration with that war to get a better handle on how early American men understood military service and what their experiences were like with the military before the Revolution. Fred Anderson is a professor of history at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's the author of 3 military histories of the French and Indian War, including The Crucible of War, The 7 Years' War and the Fate of Empire in British North America, 1754 to 1766, which is really a must-read if you want to know what really happened in that war, and A People's Army, Massachusetts Soldiers and Society in the 7 Years' War. In A People's Army, Fred documents the distinctions between British regular and colonial provincial units during the French and Indian War. I'm also sure he can help us with the distinction between provincial troops and those who served in militia units. So, why don't we go ask Fred some questions? Fred, thank you so much for joining us. As you know, we're trying to better understand the creation and operation of the American Army during the American Revolution. And it seems like we should really begin with the French and Indian War, because it's the war that gave many men who served in the Revolutionary War military experience. So, would you tell us about the traditions of militias and provincial armies in British North America?
So, the militia tradition is a very old one. It goes back far in the English legal and military history, really before the Normans, to the Anglo-Saxons, who had a notion of universal military obligation on the part of freemen called a fyrd, which was basically a kind of outgrowth of German tribal self-defense. This is very old. That's the 8th, 9th century. This kind of falls away after the Normans invade in 1066, because the Normans are not interested in having a bunch of armed Anglo-Saxons, roaming around the countryside to oppose them. So that falls away until the kings of England in the reign of Henry I and II, especially Henry II. So we're now in the 12th century, revive the idea of this universal obligation to bear arms. So there's something called the Assize of Arms in 1181, by which Henry II requires different grades of Englishmen, knights or freemen or yeomen or burghers, to have different kinds of arms. And they're supposed to keep them up and have them ready to use on command of their lords and the appointees of the crown. So that's the real ancestor of the militia that people understand as they come to North America. It goes under various kinds of cycles of decay and revival, the most important of which in the English case is in the reign of Elizabeth, during the long series of wars with Spain in the late 16th century, when Elizabeth reforms the militia system in order to restrict the holding of arms to people of, reliable property holding sorts. In other words, not just everybody could hold arms. That was thought to be quite dangerous or own them. But the militia acts of Elizabeth's reign, starting in the 1570s, require people, especially property holders in towns, to provide themselves with arms for defense. Now, those are only property holders, so they're sort of like people who would be able to vote in parliamentary elections for members of parliament. And so it's a kind of obligation imposed on people who are thought to have a stake in society in England. And in a sense, it's a privilege. In another sense, it's a tax, because to own arms, to own a musket, say, or a firelock, to own a sword or, halberd or these other arms that they were required to bear was expensive. You had to buy it, you had to maintain it, and this could cost, a lot of money. You had to have some kind of a uniform, you needed body armor. I mean, it was a pretty big obligation. So people would dodge it as much as they could. And the Elizabethan militia then is pretty much, again, in decay by the time the colonists in the 17th century immigrate to the New World. So they're aware of this tradition of military service, universal military service for self-defense, and reestablish it in colonies like Massachusetts and Virginia and Plymouth. And so all the colonies founded in North America, with the exception of Pennsylvania, which is, of course, a Quaker colony and therefore pacifist, all the other colonies have on the books statutes that require the bearing of arms, typically by men between the ages of 16 and 60, or 16 and 50. And it's regarded, again, as a kind of tax, because if you have to own a musket, you have to buy it. And that's really expensive, and most people who are other than fairly prosperous can't afford one. And then you have to have, in addition to that, all the other stuff, the powder, the shot, the flints, the cartridge boxes, the ramrod, the sling, what's called a stand of arms to make this thing work. And all of that has to be maintained, and it's a pain in the tail end. So there's a lot of shirking of this in time of peace, this obligation. It's like a form of tax dodging, actually. But in times of crisis, when the defense of settlements or towns is, a live possibility, the militia comes sort of back to life, back into focus, and then it can become actually a fairly effective mechanism of defense. So that's the tradition of bearing arms. Obviously, you have to be able to use them as well, know how to use them. And so with this obligation of acquiring the weapons or holding them and maintaining them is also the obligation of attending what were called train band sessions or train band assemblies in parishes in the South or in towns in New England, where typically once a year at least, or in times of greater crisis more frequently, you'd have to show up with your weapon for inspection. And then you would undergo some modest training in marching or shooting at a target or doing other kinds of things to familiarize people with the use of the weapons and discipline them. Make sure that they knew how to march in rows, for example, or that they knew how to respond to commands. That's really kind of cartoonish in most cases, because when you're not under immediate threat of invasion or attack, these militia days, train band days, just become kind of carnivals where people get together and walk around with their muskets and, fire at a mark, and then they get drunk and then they go home. So the militia can be a kind of cartoon of a military organization at the same time that those same people can actually become pretty effective in time of crisis if they have enough warning to begin to train and make sure that they have arms and make sure that they're well maintained.
So it sounds like militias were really designed to protect local communities rather than entire colonies.
That's exactly right. Though the obligation is to protect the colony, it's understood by militiamen themselves as defense of their towns and their families, which means that you can't really use militia for expeditions. You can't attack a distant enemy with one, because if you mobilize a militia company, which would be attached to a geographical region, you're taking all the men out of that region, some of whom are young and fit and some of whom are old and not. You're taking away property holders, you're taking away laborers, you're taking away this indiscriminate group and leaving the town defenseless, or leaving the settlement, the region defenseless. So it really doesn't work to do anything except provide for local self-defense. So the idea then, especially in this period in the late 17th century, is to regulate the holding of arms and regulate the use of them by means of laws that create provincial forces. And the first laws we see for those are in New England, where the colonies, it's in the time now of King Philip's War or Metacom's War, 1675, 76. The expeditions are made up of volunteers who are drawn from militia units. But these provincial soldiers are paid a daily wage. They're guaranteed, provisions. They're guaranteed a blanket and, effective clothing, armor if necessary, and that kind of thing, so that they can march away. Now, that means that those are people who can be spared from the towns. And that also means typically men in their late teens or through their mid-20s who are typically single and therefore kind of surplus labor that's temporarily available for this sort of service. And so that's where the provincial armies, the idea of provincial armies appears first, and it gets adopted then in every colony, again with the exception of Pennsylvania, which is founded only in the 1680s after this late 17th century series of wars on either side are over. So the Pennsylvanians never developed this tradition. Elsewhere, militia and the provincial armies go hand in hand. And the provincial armies in the north can be quite effective tools of policy and defense. So, for example, in 1745, the governments of Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island agree to raise troops, provincial troops, and send them to Louisbourg, which is this French fortress on Cape Breton Island. And this is in the course of King George's War. This is the most powerful fortress in North America. It's called the Havana of the North because it's so well constructed and so powerful. And these 3,000 or so New England provincials actually take the fort. And they do it in cooperation with a squadron of the Royal Navy, which blockades the port temporarily while the siege carries on. And this is a huge feat, a demonstration of the potential effectiveness of provincial soldiers. On the other hand, this is going on in New England, and the provincial forces are becoming more sort of capable with each successive war with France over the course of the 18th century. In the South, in Virginia, militias are not necessary to stave off attacks. After 1680 or so, they become a kind of police force to control the slaves who are becoming the increasing threat to the society and its stability as far as the masters are concerned. So in Virginia, during this period from 1680 through the 1750s, the universal concept of the militia again decays, and what takes its place is a notion of a militia obligation that's fulfilled through the arms bearing of property white men who are charged with patrolling the roads to make sure that the slaves are not running off, are not conspiring to rebel, and that sort of thing. So the militias take on this very different character depending on the society that they serve. And in slave societies in general, from Maryland to the South, they become police forces. In the middle colonies through New England, the militias become the basis for rudimentary military training and the manpower pool from which provincial soldiers can be raised for expeditions in time of war, typically against France.
I wonder if we could take a deeper look at the organization of these provincial units, because they were the ones that British commanders-in-chief, like John Campbell, the Earl of Loudoun, James Abercrombie, and Sir Geoffrey Amherst, called up to fight the French during the French and Indian War. So, Fred, would you tell us how these units were organized and what their command structure was like?
Sure. There are local variations, so let's just talk about Massachusetts, which is the group I know best. So the way that provincials are raised is at the beginning of the year, typically, legislatures are notified by the governor who's responding to an order which would come down from the commander-in-chief. And his role is to coordinate the military resources of all the colonies that he's mobilizing to campaign against the French and their allies, the Indians. So in winter, usually February or so, the commander-in-chief would issue a requisition for troops to each of these colonies. And then the governors, in turn, would approach legislatures and have them raise money and vote men to fulfill the quota that they'd been assigned. And these quotas were roughly, aligned with populations. So Massachusetts would have a much higher quota, for example, than Rhode Island or Connecticut. So that's the first step. The next step then is that with those orders passed into law and money is being appropriated, officers are appointed to organize regiments. Regiments are typically made up of 10 companies. Each company is commanded by a captain, generally speaking, and each company has between 50 and 100 men in it. So a regiment, when it marches, is called a battalion, and each battalion would have in it somewhere ideally between 500 and 1,000 men. Typically, they were closer to the lower bound than the upper in terms of manpower. Each of those men, each of those sentinels, as they were called, or privates, are paid a wage, about the equivalent of a laborer's wage, which is to say around 2 shillings a day, plus their food. And they're, for the most part, volunteers. That's why the wages are relatively high. Provincial wages are a lot higher, actually, than wages of a regular soldier in the British Army would be. Almost twice as high, actually, as a regular soldier of comparable rank would make. That's because they're hiring these people out of a pool of laborers and farmhands who, aren't obliged to serve. They're obliged to serve in the militia, but they're not obliged to serve in these provincial forces, which are voluntary. So they're competing for the manpower, and that means that the wages are often not enough to attract people, although generally speaking, they're pretty good. And at first, you get people who are eager to make a few pounds, and as much as 18 or 20 pounds in the early years of the war, and it goes up thereafter, because the wages are supplemented by bounties or enlistment bonuses. And those can equal a whole campaign's wages. So you might make 18 pounds in provincial currency, say, over the course of a campaign as a provincial private. But if you are collecting a bounty in that year, as in, say, 1758 or 59, when the manpower demands are very heavy, you can walk away with 40 pounds in pay, and that's real money. I mean, it's not just provincial currency, it's provincial currency backed by silver. So these bounties and wages are a real attractor of men. So that's the motive, and the motive that feeds into the organization is that colonels who are prominent men, often men who have either read military tracts or understand something of command because they've also been militia officers, militia colonels. These people then can choose their subordinate officers. So a regiment would have a colonel at its head. He would have a lieutenant colonel working with him, 2, I believe, or possibly 3 majors, and then 10 captains, each one commanding a company. Each company, in turn, would have a lieutenant and an ensign, which would be the equivalent of a modern second lieutenant, and then sergeants below them, and then finally the men in each company itself. So when a colonel was manning his regiment, he would make sure that he would consult with local leaders, find out which experienced men in the vicinity, typically in their mid-30s or early 40s, would likely to be able to enlist others. And so the colonel would offer a commission, a captain's commission, to the potential recruiter. And the idea would be that that man would then have the right to choose the lieutenant and the ensign who would serve under him. And each of those would then do so in return for a promise that they would raise a certain number of men, that they would enlist a certain number of men. The lieutenant or the ensign or the captain would also make the same kind of promise to the sergeants, who made about twice as much money as a private would. And each company of which would have, 1 sergeant, more than that actually, come to think of it, 2 or 3. So the sergeants promise they'll raise a certain number of men. And then the lieutenants in turn, get to count that toward their quota. And then the captain, ideally, can present his 50 men at the muster, and then the regiment is formed. It's called raising for rank, where you basically get men who are willing to bear arms, who are effectively choosing their leader for that campaign by enlisting in his company. So everything depends on local reputation. Everything depends on connections, and there are often kinship connections that structure these companies as well, because we're talking about big families that are interrelated, and captains would have, lots of nephews and kids of their own, and people from the neighborhoods that they lived in who would trust them to be an able commander and somebody they could follow, willingly without fear that their lives would just be wasted or sacrificed needlessly. Now, it's possible that all the attractions of pay and promises made in the course of enlistment and so forth would not be sufficient to attract a full regiment. In that case, and only in that case, it would be possible to impress men or draft them from the militia units, which are these, as I said before, this universal pool of manpower. Now, the way that would work is that the colonel would contact his counterpart, militia colonel, and say, I need another dozen men. I hereby require you to provide them for me. That militia colonel then would contact his captains, who would muster their men and say, got any volunteers? And then some people might come forward, others might not. If they didn't, then it would be up to the captain in those territorial companies to choose a man to serve. And he was under legal obligation to do so. So who gets drafted in that case? Well, typically what the captain would do is either draft some ne'er-do-well, who was a no-good troublemaker, and put him in the army and get him out of town. Or they would draft somebody who was, well off. Because once those people serve notice that they have to serve, they're free to hire a substitute. So then they go out and hire somebody. And so many of the people who serve in these provincial regiments are folks who simply hold back on enlistment until the very end, until they're trying to fill out the last vacancies, and then they put themselves forward to be hired as substitutes. And then they get to collect not only the wages and the bounty that's operative, but also they get whatever the person who's hiring them puts up, which can be, a considerable amount of money. So you get cases like Rufus Putnam, who was a miller out in western Massachusetts, Connecticut originally, who serves, I think he served 6 campaigns in the course of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And the last ones he's serving are all as a hired man, as a hired substitute. And he's raking in a lot of money, so he can set himself up as a miller when the campaigns are over, if he survives, and he does. And then he goes on taking this experience with him when the American Revolutionary War comes along later, Rufus Putnam, volunteers to serve in the Massachusetts forces and in the Continental Army, and ultimately winds up as the chief engineer of the Continental Army under George Washington. And he starts out just as this guy, this farm kid with ambition that he can sort of help along by taking advantage of the opportunities for serving his king during the 7 Years' War. All the stuff I'm talking about, has implications for the way that provincial soldiers behave in the field when they're on campaign. Because if you're enlisting, say, under your uncle to go off on campaign, that commander, your uncle, is probably not going to impose extremely severe discipline on you. Nothing like the kinds of discipline that British soldiers would be subjected to in regular units. So if, you're a provincial private, you're likely to be a whole lot harder to discipline and a whole lot likelier to mouth off, a lot more likely to, shirk your duty or even just desert than a regular soldier would be, because those are all offenses that could get you just, severely punished by whipping or even hanging or being shot. So British soldiers serving alongside these provincial units during the 7 Years' War, looking at the evident indiscipline of the provincials and aware that they're remarkably well paid with, comparison to the British soldiers themselves, they just conclude that the Americans are worthless soldiers. They don't know military character at all. They have no capacity to endure hardship. They're just, layabouts and collect high wages, and then they're poorly disciplined. So this tends to make British officers, particularly serving in North America during the 7 Years' War, deeply skeptical of the ability of the American provincials ever to be really serious soldiers.
We should probably talk about the provincials' training, because weren't the British regulars also skeptical of the training that they received?
Training was just regarded as what they did during the early weeks of the campaign. So in the spring, after planting, usually, these units would muster, which is to say they would gather at a place where they were obliged to come. They'd be embodied, which is to say they'd be organized in their units there. And then they'd get issued weapons and uniforms, if there were any, tents, blankets, all the other stuff they would need to do on campaign. And then they would begin to drill. And mainly the training of provincial regiments consisted as the training of modern soldiers today, at first in just learning to march together in time and to respond to commands. And this would take, a couple of weeks to get to the point where you can really rely on soldiers to be able to march well enough to respond to commands and not just sort of stumble all over each other. That same sort of thing would happen in the early weeks of campaigns. Sometimes that would actually happen while people were trying to march off to wherever they were headed for the campaign. If they were, say, supposed to assemble at Fort William Henry in the first week of July, they would have a relatively short period of time that they would have to learn these skills. And so often the skills were picked up insofar as they were at all, sort of on the march. Once they got there and they were organized, then more training would take place. And this would be basically building on the skills of marching and firearms use. So they would learn how to load the weapons. Most people knew how to do this already because they had this sort of fundamental militia training, back home from the time they were boys. So they would know how to load a musket, might know how to fire it, but they would get practice in this. And so they'd go out in a day or two and fire at marks, as they said, or targets. So they'd get used to the idea of, firing on command and loading, together. Firing in volleys is another skill that they'd have to understand, because you don't just sort of pop off your weapon at any target that appears to be one that you think you should shoot at. You wait and fire on command. So firing in volleys or firing by platoons is one of the higher level skills they had to obtain. At the same time that they had to learn how to make marching maneuvers that would put them in a line or in a column that would enable them to turn, to march on order, in order, to a destination where they could then deploy. So these are fairly complicated skills, and it takes weeks for them to acquire them. And that means that provincial companies are the first level of training. And to get a company to march together is one thing, but then to combine 10 companies into a battalion and get them all to march together is a much bigger problem, because you've got to make sure that the commands are being relayed properly. And so maneuvering in an open field if you were going to go into battle with another unit of an enemy of comparable size, you maneuver on this field by marching in formation to a position where you can fire under command. That's complicated stuff. And there are many commands that they have to learn. They have to know how to march, as I said, in columns or lines. They have to learn how to hear repeated commands in the midst of chaotic circumstances, because the commanding officers would shout the command, but then the command would have to be relayed down to men in the individual companies before the command to say fire might be executed. So there's a lot going on in this training, and almost none of it produces the kind of rigorous result that British regulars can show, because they've been doing this stuff as professionals for years. The average provincial soldier in North America in the 7 Years' War is a man of his early 20s who's had maybe 3 or 4 weeks at most of training before he's thought to be fit for duty. The average soldier in a regular company in North America would be a man of about 30 or 32 who would have been in the British Army for 10 years, who would have long ago known how to do all the necessary marching evolutions, who would be able to load his musket mechanically under great stress very rapidly, who would know how to fire on command, who would know how to wait for commands before he fired. All these are skills that would be second nature to them, but still brand new to most American provincials, which made them look like bumbling fools and bumpkins, which is pretty much what the British thought they were.
So what do you do if you're the British with these not so well-trained provincial men? I mean, how do these provincial units fit within the regular British Army strategy and structure during the French and Indian War?
That's a great question, because obviously you don't want to rely on these people if you don't have to fight the enemy, because they're not very promising material. And again, one of the issues is just whether or not you can re-enlist people, so that you get seasoned soldiers, ones who've been trained in the previous year, to re-enlist. That's a fairly big task that provincial armies undertake. So over time, with more and more re-enlistments from year to year taking place, the provincials do get better. They're not just total fools the whole time. And eventually they get to the point where they can actually be used in fighting. But for the most part, they're used in roles that don't require them to actually use their weapons against an enemy at all. What they do is, because everything that armies have to do has to be done by hand. So they dig trenches, they dig latrines, they cut roads, they perform all kinds of what are called fatigue duties. So just the kinds of, building huts, or if you're engaged in a siege, that's all pick and shovel work for the most part. And those trenches have to be dug. The specifications set down by engineers, they have to be really well controlled. Provincials are the ones who wind up doing those things. And as I said, they cut roads, they build forts. They will man or garrison forts so that the regulars can be freed up to go on marching campaigns against the enemy. So they become what we would call support troops for the most part. And yet, over time, people like Rufus Putnam become really quite capable soldiers, because they become used to the life of a soldier. They acquire the skills they need. And so the 7 Years' War armies, especially in New England, New York, New Jersey, produce very large numbers of men in their 20s, then when they're enlisted or in their teens, who become proficient to a fairly high degree in understanding what a soldier's life is like and what they're supposed to do. And many of them become like Rufus Putnam, who starts off as a private, winds up as a lieutenant at the end of the 7 Years' War. And later in the Revolutionary era, when these people re-enlist as soldiers serving their provinces, Massachusetts or Connecticut or wherever, they're not starting from nothing. They're starting from actually a fairly high level of proficiency and a clear understanding of hierarchy and command.
Yeah. Could we talk about how the provincial army units from the French and Indian War served as the precursor to the Continental Army of the Revolutionary War?
Even before there's a Continental Army, that's formed in June 1775, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire troops are being sent to Boston in the aftermath of the Concord and Lexington alarm. And those are what are called minute companies. They're formations from within militia units that have been specially prepared to act quickly and who've been trained to a higher level than your average militiaman would be. So these companies that initially trap the British in Boston after April 19, 1775 are embodied militia who then are taken into provincial service by their governments or the congresses of the provinces that they serve. So that's exactly the model that they're operating on, is the model of the provincial army. So those guys outside of Boston become a provincial army serving each of their provinces, each of their colonies. They're officers commissioned by the Congress of that colony or its governor. And they're doing exactly what provincial soldiers would do. They're digging trenches, they're training, they're, keeping the British trapped in Boston so they can't get out. So that is the beginning of the Continental Army, because those provincial troops from the various New England provinces are all taken into the command of the Continental Congress in June, when they resolve to adopt them as a Continental Army under the command of this Virginian who'd been experienced on the Virginia frontier during the 7 Years' War, George Washington. So he's appointed general and sent up to Boston, and he takes command. So what has he got? Well, he's got people who have been enlisted for a limited period of time, really up until just the end of the year, 1775. And so Washington then has to figure out some way to try to get control of these people, to train them to a level that's really efficient, to discipline them such that they're able to really obey commands, or get rid of people who can't be disciplined. So that's pretty much what Washington does from July of 75 until the end of the year. He's trying to impose order and discipline on those provincial units, which have been raised by Massachusetts or Connecticut or Rhode Island or whatever. And he's doing that in such a way as to try to impress on them that they're no longer just serving their provinces, they're serving the Congress as a kind of representative of all Americans, defending all Americans' rights. That's the key to the beginning of the Continental Army. And Washington then is trying from the very get-go to persuade these men in the ranks to re-enlist. And he's hoping that he'll be able to raise men for more than just a year at a time. Congress is very reluctant to let that happen. Eventually, they agree to enlistments for multiple years, 3 years at first, and then ultimately 3 years are the duration of the war. So you can get men to do longer enlistments, longer serving people know their jobs better, they become reliable, and so on. That's what Washington wants, because he knows that if he has to sort of enlist people anew for every campaign, he's going to have the problems that provincial troops always had, which is to say it takes them 2 months just to get to the point where they can reliably march and understand orders. And then it takes another 2 months after that before they become reasonably proficient. And then that's 4 months, and their enlistments are typically up in another 2 months after that. So then you got to start all over again. Washington knows he can't have that. So he needs to have people who are longer term soldiers. He needs to keep, begging for re-enlistments. He keeps trying to build up sort of a sense of esprit de corps, a sense of, common endeavor among the men. And that's the nucleus then of the Continental Army.
Provincial regiments formed the heart of the Continental Army. They began to take shape in the late 17th century when they developed as an outgrowth of the militia tradition. Since militia units were meant to protect local communities, they couldn't be sent away to fight in distant campaigns. So, to better protect the colony and to fight the French when called upon by the Empire, many colonies formed provincial units, regiments of American men who volunteered to fight and serve away from home. Now, service in provincial units proved arduous, not only because the men might be expected to fight in battle, but also because of the manual labor it involved. Given their limited training in comparison to regular British Army units, British commanders-in-chief typically used provincial units to perform support roles. Provincials dug trenches, cut roads, and built fortifications. And, as it turned out, these were handy skills to have. In fact, they were exactly the skills revolutionary Americans needed after the battles of Lexington and Concord to keep the British trapped in Boston. But how do you transform units adept at performing fatigue duties into a disciplined fighting force? This was a task that faced George Washington when he arrived in Boston in July 1775 to take command of the newly formed Continental Army. We should pick up our exploration of the American Army in the War for Independence with Washington's arrival in Boston by speaking with Randy Flood. Randy is a military historian and an instructor and program developer at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. Randy will know how Washington transformed these provincial units into the Continental Army, and how that transformation impacted the military experience of the men who served in its ranks. Plus, he may also be able to tell us a bit more about the relationship between the Continental Army and the more local militia units that served in the Revolutionary War. But before we meet Randy, let's talk about the Omohundro Institute and the William and Mary Quarterly. This episode is made possible by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. In partnership with the Journal of the Early Republic, the William and Mary Quarterly is publishing a special issue dedicated to investigating the American Revolution. So, why did not one but two early American history journals decide to reinvestigate the history of the American Revolution? Well, as we've been exploring, the American Revolution wasn't just one event, but a series of many events. Not just one response to a one-sided issue, but a many-faceted response to a many-sided issue, and well, there's still a lot more to discover. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, but really, just how much more is there to discover about an event that took place nearly 250 years ago? This is one of the questions our friend Alan Taylor picks up in his introduction to this special William and Mary Quarterly issue. Now, you may remember from our discussion with Alan in episode 128 that he's interested in the causes and consequences of the American Revolution. And it's the same in his introduction titled Expand or Die, The Revolution's New Empire. Alan explores how all the articles in this special issue emphasize continuities rather than change. He notes that while all the articles explore different aspects of the revolution and the social change it brought over time, the articles ultimately show how the violence of the Revolutionary War compelled people to make unexpected changes of enduring import. So, what important and enduring changes did early Americans make? Find out by ordering a copy of this special American Revolution-themed issue of the William and Mary Quarterly for a listeners-only discounted rate of just $10. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ promo to order your special discounted copy. Randy, we've been speaking with Fred Anderson about the history of the provincial regiments. He noted that those regiments really formed the core of the Continental Army as the Second Continental Congress created its army by adopting the provincial forces in Boston on June 14, 1775. Then, on June 15, 1775, Congress appointed George Washington to serve as commander-in-chief of that army. So, Randy, what was the situation in Boston like when Washington arrived to take command of this army?
There was pretty much a stalemate. The militias were not only not well organized, but they didn't have heavy artillery to drive the British out of Boston. And the British were pretty compact and had access to all the supplies that they needed to stay in Boston. So there was really a stalemate. Also, the British were anxious to mount any kind of an offensive against the Americans because they'd taken about 1,000 casualties of men killed, wounded, or captured at Breed's Hill. So Washington arrived on the scene after Breed's Hill to basically try to mold into shape these militias and call them basically a Continental Army. Shortly thereafter, when the British did evacuate in March of 1776, they left for Halifax, taking a lot of loyalists with them who wanted to flee. So they went to Halifax, and then Howe returned with many more ships of the line and supply ships, and numbering, I think, close to about 30,000 troops to seize New York. The idea that the British had in mind, Liz, was a simple fact that they recognized they had enemies all over the world, and they knew that those enemies of theirs would try to get arms and ammunition and tents and uniforms and money and supplies to us rebels. In order to shut down that contraband reaching us, they realized that seizing the ports and controlling that type of under-the-table trade was their key to snuffing out this rebellion. So New York was a prime target, as was Charleston and other cities, and so they came to New York, and then Washington brought that ragtag group of what you probably call part-time National Guardsmen down from Boston to New York to try to stop them. There were only ever so few state militias that really evolved into solid regiments within Washington's army. The people from the Blue Hens from Delaware and the Maryland troops were a little more experienced, a little bit more seasoned, a little bit better trained, and they really provided a foundation for Washington to build his army around. So they provided exemplary service during the battles of New York. Washington lost all those battles in New York. He would fight a battle, retreat to a fortification, fight another battle, continue to retreat, and finally the British chased him down through New Jersey and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And then, of course, he later on was able to pull his ragtag militia, or you might say part-time army, together to get a small win at Trenton and then another one at Princeton, and then going up into the mountains for the winter of 1776-77 at Morristown. It really wasn't until Valley Forge the following year where Washington was able to bring his troops together and under the leadership of Baron von Steuben, who came over here from Prussia, to develop a manual of operations and drill the Continental troops and kind of mold them and shape them, that Washington really had an opportunity to build his army, if you will, starting at the very basic level with companies, which generally had about 50 members, and then that evolved into, if you have 8 to 10 companies, that's going to form a regiment or a battalion. A regiment and battalion are really interchangeable. And then you get 3 or 4 regiments, and they will form a brigade. And then a division is made up of 2 or 3 brigades, and then finally you have a wing of your army. And all that came into being when Washington organized the Continental Army along those lines. So you have a left wing, a center, and a right wing. That's generally the way it worked in the Continental Army at the time.
You noted that before the winter at Valley Forge, which took place in 1777-1778, that the Continental Army was more like a group of part-time National Guardsmen than a professional army. Was it more like a part-time fighting force due to a lack of training, or due to the fact that there were short enlistment periods?
Both. The initial enlistment period was 6 months to a year. And bear in mind, militia is distinct from a formal army. You know, they've got families, they've got crops to raise. They have only a limited amount of time to serve. What Washington wanted was full-time service. But he had to offer benefits, which never came. He had to offer money, which didn't come. And then later on in the war, land was offered by the Continental Congress, or the promise of land, which very few got. Eventually, by 1777, when the Army was more of an army, evolving from multiple militias, they had like 3-year enlistments where they actually served for 3 years, and then later on until the end of the war. So they tried various means to try to keep groups together. But Washington always had wanted to have an army that would fight European style. Not a lot of battles were actually fought European style, obviously. In America, there's different terrain, different conditions under which the battles evolved. And particularly when you get to the South, you're going to have a whole different style of fighting.
You know, before we get into tactics and military strategies of the war, let's explore the differences between the Continental Army units and the militia units. If you were a young man, say between 1775 and 1781, and you had a choice between enlisting in the Continental Army or fulfilling your service in a local militia unit, how did you decide where to serve? I mean, how did service in the Continental Army differ from service in the militia?
I think it depended on your personal circumstances. For example, many troops of the Continental Army were young men, 17, 18 years of age. Some of them might not have had the most sterling reputations. Maybe they were looking for making some money. They might have maybe had less than stellar careers. A lot of them didn't have families, and they were able to serve for longer periods of time. And maybe the excitement of war, the excitement of battle, the smell of smoke, maybe the chance to be a hero, all inspired young men then, as it inspires many young men to go to war today. Also, when you get a little bit older, you develop families, responsibilities. You've got a farm to take care of. You've got children to raise. You've got fields to hoe. It was much easier for people to become members of a militia, which only fell out maybe several times a month for training. And then sometimes they were called up or involved in activities that would lead them to augmenting the standard military. For example, if you're a man, you're raising a family, you have to be back at home to raise the crops for planting season. And the militia, they were less experienced in military tactics. They didn't have to drill as much. They didn't have to fire in unison. They didn't have to load and fire a musket 3 times in 1 minute. So they were really part-time military volunteers. They were used in a variety of capacities, whether it's protecting the frontier from Indian attacks, because the main army was primarily around the cities where the British were. The militia helped to prevent slave uprisings. They were a pool of recruits from which the regular army could draw on. And in many instances, when the prisoners, whether they were Hessians or British prisoners, were captured, our prisons were on the western frontier, such as Fort Frederick, Maryland, and Winchester, Virginia, and even Charlottesville, which was even more rural back then. They guarded prisoners of war because the main army could not do that all the time. And they also protected the states, really, when the regular army was away. They herded cattle. They were involved in supplies, provide and augment those things that the regular army needed, such as wagoneers to transport supplies, those types of things. They transported ammunition and food and clothing. And they also assisted in constructing fortifications. So they were an augmentation of the main army, and they did a good job. In some instances, militias were much better trained depending on the section of the country where their service was required, and they had to step up and do the job that a Continental Army might do. On any daily basis, a soldier's routine is going to be along the lines of drilling, marching, cooking, guard duty, foraging for food and supplies, cleaning and care of their muskets and their accoutrements, their weaponry, and more drilling and marching. It's pretty standard procedure for the average member of the Continental Army to do those types of things. And militia basically would come and go, not as they pleased, but they would come and go, and they were permitted the flexibility of going back and returning to their homes as opposed to being in an army full-time on a daily basis.
Drilling, marching, cooking, cleaning, foraging. Randy, you don't make life in the Continental Army sound all that glamorous. But is that what everyday life was really like for soldiers in the Continental Army?
Yes, you fight when the battle is there, but you have to be on a standby capability. For example, once the British occupied New York and Washington came down to defend New York, they're doing a lot of fighting. But then once the battles of New York were over and Washington was able to slip across the Delaware River, they continued to fight. They waited a week between Trenton and Princeton before they fought again, but then they went up into the mountains of Morristown and spent the winter, and during the winter months, you're not going to be doing much fighting. So every time the British occupied a major city, particularly New York or Philadelphia, the Continental Army would spend time at Valley Forge, for example, when the British were occupying Philadelphia in the winter of 1777-78. Washington took that time to drill those soldiers with von Steuben. And, they have to be disciplined. They have to be regimented. They have to learn how to march. They have to learn how to fire at one target with, 30, 40, 50, 100 men in a line in different ranks. They have to fire 3 times in 1 minute. They have to really try to hold themselves out to be as every bit as good as the professional British and Hessian armies with whom they're facing when they do face battle. But absolutely, learning, drilling, marching was something that if you're going to move with precision on a battlefield and you're moving from one end of the field to the other to try to outflank the enemy, or depending on what the strategy is to remove them from fortifications, you have to be able to move it with speed, to have people know what they're doing, and all that's a part of the learning process of a day-to-day basis of a soldier. So did they cook and clean and march and drill? Absolutely. Was it mundane? You better believe it. There's no question about it. But you have to be prepared, because what you have is a standby readiness capability so that if you're ever attacked or you have the opportunity to fight in battle, you know what to do. And that wasn't necessarily applicable to militia. The standing army, that was the goal. Washington wanted to try to have Americans develop into a professional army that would rival the British as well as the Hessians.
George Washington wanted a professional army that could go toe-to-toe with the British and German forces they faced. Randy, you noted that Washington really wanted an army that could fight European style. Would you tell us about the military tactics that the Continental Army used during the Revolutionary War?
The conditions determined the tactics. Obviously, the British were trying to secure a foothold along the seaports, be able to control any contraband that was reaching us one way or the other. Obviously, if we received contraband, that would strengthen our efforts to try to fight them. So it depended primarily on the terrain. And the tactics that would be used would be to try to stop the British from basically capturing us. We were fighting as much of a defensive war as we were an offensive war. So ideal conditions in Europe would say that 2 well-developed armies would get on a field of battle. They'd fire 3 or 4 volleys at one another. If you're in a line of, say, 500 troops, and then you have a second rank of 500 more, and a third rank of 500 more, these troops have the capability of firing a musket 3 times in 1 minute. So within literally the first volley, if you're on the opposing side, you've got 500 pieces of lead moving in your direction. Seconds later, you have another 500 moving in your direction. And seconds later after that, you have another 500. So that's, 1,500 pieces of lead coming across 100 yards, the equivalent of a football field. And they're going to take out a lot of your troops before you even get the first shot off. If you have your shot, then you're going to try to take out theirs. The idea is uniformity of firepower. The idea is concentrated with these lines, and then once people fall beside you and you're getting blood splattered all over you, you're going to have to reform that rank so you can issue another volley. And basically, it's which side can decimate the other to the extent that after 3 volleys, and both sides have killed a lot of individuals or wounded a lot of individuals, and one side, most likely the Hessian side or the British side, they're going to fix bayonets, and then they're going to march toward you. And by that time, the Americans are going to be running. Washington had wanted to build an army that would stand in the face of the British bayonets. And not only that, he wanted to have our troops disciplined to the extent that if we had bayonets for our muskets, most of our muskets were French and did have bayonets accompany them, then we would be able to march at them with bayonets just like they did with us. That rarely happened. We didn't have that many bayonet-to-bayonet types of battles. It was primarily tailored to how much damage can we do to them. So I don't know that Washington ever really achieved, until maybe the end of the war, the capability that he really wanted to achieve in the American Army based upon the tactics and the formations and the discipline that he really wanted to grow with an American Army.
Now, the British Army in the 18th century was one of the most well-trained professional armies in the world, and it had different specialized fighting units, light infantry, grenadiers, artillery. Did the Continental Army likewise have similar specialized fighting units? You know, perhaps something along the lines of the Green Berets or Navy SEALs today?
As far as the Special Forces angle, the fact is that we were compelled really to use hit-and-run partisan guerrilla tactics, because when the armies in the South were removed, when you had the defeat of Camden of the regular army and then the capture of about 5,600 troops at Charleston, and those were regularly trained armies along with militia, when they were all captured, you had these partisan bands develop, and of course people have heard of the famous Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, but you had other people like Thomas Sumter, William Richardson Davie in North Carolina, Elijah Clark in Georgia, and of course Andrew Pickens also in South Carolina, along with Sumter and Francis Marion, organized these partisan guerrilla bands. And you might say that because they were trained so well in the French and Indian War, under people like Robert Rogers of Rogers Rangers, when they had these partisans that were really trained for special force type activity, they were really the ancestors really of today's Green Beret, Special Forces, Navy SEALs, that type of thing. And so were they organized specifically like that? No, Washington didn't really have a Special Forces unit that was used hit-and-run tactic. He just didn't move in that direction. He was more tailored to trying to have a formal, organized professional army that would go toe-to-toe with the British on a field of honor. But the tactics that were used in the South and in certain areas of the North as well, but primarily in the South, it was by necessity that they had to resort to the hit-and-run partisan tactics, and it evolved into a Special Forces type of unit. And of course, that was augmented by those special units that were utilized, like Daniel Morgan's riflemen. The Congress organized in 1775. They did vote to have 10 rifle companies from the western regions of basically Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. And Morgan raised one of those companies, and they did report in Boston to be part of the regular army. The rifles, they were our special forces, but that's about as far as it went. The type of tactics that were used in the South evolved into special forces that we recognize today.
Randy, several of the examples you've used during our conversation have referred to fighting in the South. And when we think about the War for Independence, we tend to think about it in terms of campaigns. The Canada Campaign, the Saratoga Campaign, and the Southern Campaign. So Randy, would you tell us about campaigns during this war, and perhaps about the Southern Campaign in particular?
Well, when they organized and created the Continental Army back in June of 1775, they also organized various departments where they felt they would be fighting the war. It consisted primarily of about 7 major departments. They had a Canadian department, they had an Eastern department, which was primarily driven through New England, and then they had New York. They had a Northern department. Then they had the Highlands, which you call basically a portion of New York, which would be the West Point area, Hudson Valley area. That was later integrated into the Northern department. Then they had the Middle department, which was primarily Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. And then, of course, they had the Southern department, which would include Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and then the Western department, which would be everything probably west of the Appalachians. This is where you get into the battles that were conducted by George Rogers Clark and Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Vincennes in his Western campaigns, and also John Sullivan's efforts to exterminate the Iroquois in Western New York. Those were the Western campaign areas. And of course, the idea was that you had a certain number of troops, certainly never at maximum capacity, but you had a certain number of troops stationed in each of those areas where warfare would be conducted. if in fact that opened up as a theater of operations or an attempt for the British to suppress that area. Basically, we responded to where the British were. The British had four major strategies, the first of which was obviously to shut down the ports, and they tried to do that at Charleston. We were able to fend them off on June 28, 1776, and then they shifted their total resources to New York, and that's where Washington came down from Boston to try to confront them. And then once the British had lost the battles of Trenton and Princeton, they came up with a third strategy, and that was to divide New England. They asked themselves, where are the troublemakers? Where can we nip this rebellion in the bud before it gets too much out of hand? Because they were very embarrassed by the battles they lost to Trenton and Princeton, and they wanted to really divide the colonies and see if they couldn't get a win. So they decided to bring in three armies in their third strategy. Basically, they decided where they would divide New England by bringing an army in from the west, one from the north, and one from the south. They would all converge in Albany and lure George Washington up to Albany and crush his army of Continentals. Well, it didn't work out that way, obviously, because of the Battle of Saratoga. The British lost. That was the first major defeat of a British army in North America. And one of the reasons that loss occurred is that the Third Army that was destined to hook up with General Burgoyne's army coming from the north was commanded by General Howe. And General Howe came up with a third whole strategy, and that strategy was, let's take Philadelphia and we'll capture the Continental Army. In Europe, if you capture the capital of a nation or a country, then you usually win. And their strategy was Howe would take credit for winning the war by capturing Philadelphia, the rebel capital, and the Continental Congress. Well, he came down to Philly. He did capture Philly, but nobody was home. The Congress was away. They were working at York, Pennsylvania, a safe distance outside the city. And so Washington felt an obligation to try to defend the capital city. So he lost the battle at Brandywine. He did attack Germantown, but then he lost that battle. We gave up the forts defending the Delaware River, which lead to Philadelphia, at Mifflin and Mercer, which in fact the river was a supply line for the British Army that wintered in Philadelphia. And so things just didn't work out for us at all. And after Philadelphia was occupied during the winter of 1777-78, Washington had his army trained at Valley Forge on the outskirts of Philly to keep an eye on what was happening with the British. And as a result, when the British were departing Philadelphia and returning to New York, Washington attacked them at Monmouth. But that battle was a draw with no decisive winner. And it was then that the British decided that they were involved more at the international level. France had come into the war at the international level. Spain was helping us. The Dutch were helping us. And the British had to defend basically places like Gibraltar and India and other parts of the world. So they were taking troops out of America to redeploy them in areas where the British felt it was more strategic for them to hold on to these areas around the world. And as a result, they were thinking of who can pick up the slack. Who is it that we can rely on in America to try to hold on to these colonies? So they looked at where that support was in America, and they concluded that the lion's share of people who were sympathetic to the British crown and the king and the cause were in the South. So they shifted their attention to the South, and they captured Savannah in December of 1779. And then they decided to focus again on Charleston, which they captured during the siege between April and May of 1780. And it looked actually like their policy was beginning to work. Then we had an army go south at Camden, and we lost that. So we're losing these cities, we're losing these seaports, and we're losing these battles. And what's happening is that gives rise to the partisan guerrilla activities that were designed to try to wear down and bleed the British of their resources in the South. So it was really a battle of attrition that caused the British to pull back to these ports for resupply after a weary 1780 and 81 with multiple battles. More battles were fought in the South during 1780 and 1781 than all the battles combined in the North and in the Mid-Atlantic colonies during the entire war.
Earlier, you said that these partisan guerrilla fighters were actually militia units that were highly trained and effective in the Southern campaign. Would you tell us more about the role these militia units played in the war and how they worked in conjunction with the regular Continental Army?
Well, they started out as the only force available when the Continental armies in the south at Charleston and at Camden were defeated. That's really all we had to depend upon. And they would disperse after many of these battles, go back to their farms, their communities. What evolved in the South was really a civil war between those people favoring independence and those people favoring the crown. And some people would change back and forth on a regular basis from one side to another, depending on where they thought the war was moving. but it was people like Marion and Sumter and Pickens and Elijah Clark and William Richardson Davie that really were in the forefront of the guerrilla activity. And when Nathaniel Greene came south, we went through 4 commanders of the regular Continental Army in the South. Robert Howe was trying to defend Savannah, and he gave that up. Horatio Gates was the commander and lost, of course, with the entire Continental Army at Camden. Benjamin Lincoln gave up Charleston. So you have these commanders of these Continental armies, and they're being defeated. They're being outnumbered. They're being overwhelmed. And what you have left is the group of militia there, a seasoned group of militia to fight the war or carry it on. But the first real commander who came south to head up the Southern Theater was a confidant of George Washington, actually being groomed to perhaps even succeed him one day, was Nathaniel Greene. And the difference about Greene was he was a professional soldier, but he knew that he didn't know the guerrilla tactics. He deferred to people like Marion and others who were seasoned veterans, and I might add, a little older. Marion was the same age as George Washington. They were both born in 1732. So Greene had tremendous respect for Francis Marion and deferred to these leaders who would conduct the hit-and-run guerrilla-style warfare in the South because it worked. So one of the things that Greene decided was that he would gradually build a Continental Army, and of course that eventually happened. But he relied very heavily on Daniel Morgan's riflemen and the troops that Morgan had assembled and Marion had assembled to basically use that as the cornerstone of developing a Continental Army. The other good news is that the French were able to penetrate America by way of the Chesapeake Bay and come up the York and James River and drop off arms, ammunition, tents, uniforms, money, flints, powder, that type of thing, where wagons would be procured by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to take those supplies to the central part of Virginia, where they had a training camp that was supervised by Baron von Steuben, and eventually a lot of those flints and powder and muskets would find their way south to these guerrilla bands. So bear in mind that Nathaniel Greene was a quartermaster at Valley Forge, so he knew how to procure supplies. He knew how to get arms and equipment into the hands of the troops, so he really built it around the militia and began to rebuild an army. So he was fully equipped by the time he challenged Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse, and even though that battle was fought to a draw, Greene did not chase Cornwallis up to Yorktown. He decided to focus on the Loyalist training camps, where Americans who favored the crown were being trained to fight in the British Army. So he attacked basically 96, which was a Loyalist training camp, and also another place called Augusta. And by wiping out those training camps, that removed the training capability of the British training Americans to fight for them against their fellow Americans. You know, even though he didn't really win a single battle in the South, he worked to try to, along with the partisans, to build a Continental Army that eventually, by the time he fought Alexander Stewart to a draw at Eutaw Springs, which was the last major battle in the South before Yorktown, he basically was able to get these British commanders so beaten down through his use of tactics of a combination of the militia and the Continental troops battering them that they were all beginning to pull back to the coast to await resupply to determine when they're going to keep moving this war forward. By that time, Cornwallis had been defeated at Yorktown, and the British decided to throw in the towel. So the militia did work very closely with the Continental troops by the end of the war. In fact, at the Battle of Eutaw Springs, the right wing of the entire Continental Army was made up of very disciplined militia, and it was commanded by Francis Marion of Greene's Continental Army.
Could we talk about the Battle of Yorktown? Because wasn't this the battle that ended the fighting of the Revolutionary War?
Well, that's a stretch for history books to say that. I know they do say it, but Yorktown was not the last battle of the American Revolution, and it didn't end the war. What Yorktown did do was provide an opportunity for the anti-war faction of the British Parliament to say enough is enough. They didn't pay off the French and Indian War, and they were 6 or 7 times more deeply in debt. They realized, in fact, that it was natural for them to go to war with France or go to war with Spain. But the fact of getting into war with their own English colonies, that's ridiculous. They said they should have never done that. So they basically decided to try to negotiate an end to the war and refocus their attention on places like Gibraltar, India, and other parts of the world that were much more important to the British Empire. Having said that, Yorktown was important because it was the second major defeat of a major British army, but in fact, it was not the last battle of the war. It triggered peace talks. It took 2 years for the peace talks to occur. What happened was that the word didn't get out that Yorktown was a battle that ended the war. we knew that we had done the British some damage. What we did was force them to seek peace talks, and they did. But battles continued throughout the South, in particular, through 1782 and on into 1783. Charleston was finally evacuated by the British in December 1782. New York was evacuated by the British completely in September of 1783. So Yorktown, was it the last battle? No. Did it end the war? No. Was it significant and basically show the British that we were prepared to continue if necessary? Yes. So I think it really provided something for them to think about what they really wanted to do with these colonies, because the British had a lot more things on their plate than just America to worry about. We just wore them down, basically, is what happened. And Yorktown we isolated Cornwallis. He couldn't get the resupply fleet. It wasn't an equal matchup between the British and the French at the Battle of the Capes. We were very fortunate to have Admiral de Grasse and the entire French Navy of 26 man-of-war ships to come up here from the West Indies for a brief period of time. The British didn't know about that. They were bringing supply ships in, and Admiral Graves had several warships, but they were primarily freight ships. They were ships that were bringing supplies to the British, so it wasn't an even up battle between the French and the British at the Battle of the Capes, and as a result, the French were able to defeat that supply convoy, if you will. And when they returned to New York and General Clinton was able to send the full Navy down there, the battle had been already over. So we were basically able to cut off Cornwallis from getting resupplied, and he had no choice but really to surrender because we had so many French. The French outnumbered the Americans 2-1 almost in terms of troops. So if we were going to fight the British even up, we had 7,500 troops. They had 8,500. Who knows? They probably would have defeated us. But the fact that we had 10,000 plus more French than they did, it was a lopsided victory, you might say, for the Americans and the French at Yorktown.
When George Washington arrived in Boston to take command of the Continental Army in July 1775, he found a group of disorganized provincial regiments. This was not an army that would do. What Washington wanted was an army that could hold their own fighting with 18th century linear battlefield tactics. This was a force that was going to require a great deal of training and discipline to create. Linear tactics were designed to maximize firepower by making it uniform. This was accomplished by marching soldiers into a field and having them stand shoulder to shoulder in multiple rows, facing their enemy at a distance of about 100 yards. As they stood shoulder to shoulder, they fired their muskets line by line, with each line firing about 3 shots per minute. As they fired these musket volleys, their enemy fired theirs. Then, after multiple volleys of musket fire, the soldiers who were left standing fixed their bayonets and charged into battle. American soldiers proved largely incapable of meeting the British Army on the field of battle using these tactics until after an intense winter of training at Valley Forge. Proper, rigorous training, combined with longer enlistment periods, gave the Continental Army the discipline and experience it needed to engage with linear tactics. But North America was not Europe, and conditions and environment largely dictated the tactics fighting units used. And linear tactics didn't work well in frontier areas, urban areas, or in other places without large fields. This is in part why militia units in the South found success fighting the British Army using guerrilla tactics. American soldiers hid behind trees, went on quick hit-and-run raids, and disengaged when the fortunes of battle began to turn. Over time, Southern and Western militia units became adept and experienced fighters. In fact, necessity required them to. Because in the Southern and Western theaters, the Continental Army wasn't often available to protect the region, or in cases when it was available, it didn't always prove effective at offering protection. Of course, frontier militia units also had the help of really seasoned, battle-tested fighters. As we explored in episode 123, the American Revolution impacted Native American communities. And although many Native American peoples worked hard to remain neutral, for many peoples, neutrality simply wasn't an option. The Revolutionary War raged right through their lands. Therefore, we still have one more aspect of the American Army that we need to explore if we're to understand the different types of men who served in its ranks, why they served, and their military experiences during the War for Independence. We still need to explore the military participation and contributions of Native American fighters. Now, since Randy brought us into the Southern theater, and since there are regional variations, let's explore a Southern case study of Native American fighters who fought alongside American soldiers. Brooke Bauer is an assistant professor of history and Native American studies at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. She's also a citizen of the Catawba Indian Nation of South Carolina. The Catawba were a people known for their ferocity and bravery in battle. They're also one of the Native American peoples who chose to fight with the Revolutionaries. So let's continue our exploration of the American Revolutionary Army by speaking with Brooke about the service and contributions of the Catawba. Brooke, we'd like to better understand the role Native American fighters played in the Revolutionary War. Specifically, we'd like to know about the role played by Catawba fighters. But before we explore that role, would you help us better know the Catawba people? Would you tell us about Catawba culture and society in the mid-18th century?
The Catawba Nation was a group of coalesced native groups from Carolinas by the 1750s. They had fully merged together under the Issawa or Catawba Indians. So before the coalescence, all these Indians were known collectively as the Piedmont Indians. They all spoke the Eastern Siouan language, but each had their own distinct dialect. They were experiencing catastrophic losses because of disease, Indian slavery, warfare, and their populations declined dramatically. So this is going to force or compel them to seek protection under the Issawa, or what we think of today as Catawba Indians. They're merging with them for defensive purposes. So the Piedmont Indians, including the Issawas, they lived along the upper and lower Catawba River Valley. So from Morganton, North Carolina, all the way as far south as the Lake Wateree Dam, that area, and as far west as the Pee River, and as far east as the Broad River, which was the boundary between Catawba Territory and Cherokee Territory. So these Piedmont Indians had similar customs, so it made it a little bit easier for them to merge together and eventually become the Catawba Nation. Some of the similarities that they shared was they traced their kinship through the female line, and they're making pottery in very similar ways. Their world was really turned upside down by the 1750s, and it would continue over the next few decades. So they had instability in their world that was caused by warfare, enemy raids, disease, and very severe environmental changes. So all these factors worked to keep their lives in constant chaos. Some of the violence that Catawbas confronted by the mid-1750s mainly came from northern Indians, including the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Shawnee, Delaware, and even towards the west, the Cherokee. And all these groups conducted raids against the Catawbas and vice versa since at least the late 1600s. So in addition to war, they are also experiencing severe droughts and famine, and these come along at the same time that the 1759 smallpox epidemic hit the Catawba Nation. So this reduced the population from about 1,500 people to 500 people. So it was very catastrophic. And leader at the time, he was talking to the South Carolina governor. He said, "We are a small nation, but our name is high." So he's saying, even though we're small, our name is well known.
It sounds like the Catawba must have had a very dynamic culture, given that you had all of these different Piedmont peoples coming together to form one people. Plus, I have to imagine the Catawba were interacting with the Euro-American settlers who were settling around them. So would you tell us more about the cultural dynamic of the Catawba and about their interactions with white settlers?
Well, it was very fluid, at least for other native people from the Piedmont area of North and South Carolina. They accepted refugees from at least 25 different native groups. And like I said, they all spoke the same language, just different dialects. And once settlers started moving into the area, Catawbas pretty much got along with most of the settlers. And to the east, they really established strong friendships with the Quaker Irish settlers in Camden, South Carolina. So it's a little bit different than what's happening elsewhere, because by the time of the American Revolution, Catawbas are pretty much surrounded by European settlers. In fact, one of the leaders, Colonel Ayres at the time, He said that settlers are at their very back doors. So that really relays how close settlers were to their villages.
You mentioned that white settlers surrounded the Catawba, and that by and large the Catawba got along with these settlers. Now, as you know, during the 17th and 18th centuries, many Native American peoples used the imperial rivalries between France, Spain, and Great Britain to their advantage by seeking better alliances with Europeans and Euro-American settlers and with other Native American groups. Therefore, would you tell us about Catawba diplomacy and whether the Catawba also used imperial rivalries to their advantage?
That's a great question. So Catawba diplomacy operated in a similar way to other southeastern native groups, but their diplomacy was more localized. So Catawbas didn't have interactions with the French and the Spanish. So rather than playing one empire against another to get trade goods and gifts, Catawbas instead, they pitted one colony against the other. And the three colonies that they played off of, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. But Catawba's alliance with South Carolina would be the strongest because in the 1750s, Governor Glenn was really looking out for Catawbas. He worked to help Catawbas, primarily because he knew he needed them as a buffer against the Cherokee and other Indians coming into the backcountry from the north. And at the same time, this is when the French and Indian War is going on, so he's really concerned about the security of the colony. And this kind of diplomacy just keeps going on up to the American Revolution.
What types of goods and trade did the Catawbas seek, and what types of goods and services did they have to offer in trade?
So in the early period, in the 1750s, they're still trading deerskin hides, some bearskin hides. The women haven't yet started trading pottery heavily. The pottery still has a utilitarian use. But the trade goods that they were looking for was sewing material, so needles, thread. They wanted cloth, textile cloth. So really the trade wool, they especially like the reds and the greens. And they took some of the metal goods and reconstructed them into body adornments because Catawbas were especially well known for wearing hearts or tinkling bells from their nose. And so they had to make these themselves from the metal goods that they received.
It also sounds like the Catawba were trading services in the sense that they had these three colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, all seeking to ally with them so that their colonies would have some sort of protection from northeastern Indian and French raids during the French and Indian War. Yeah,
exactly. So from Virginia, they're really looking for trade goods. While Virginia thinks that the Catawbas should go into the Ohio River Valley and fight in the war, Catawbas are less interested in that. And instead, the alliance with South Carolina, the governor of South Carolina, he encourages them to stay at home, protect their people, protect the women and children, because their towns are raided so often. He told the Catawba leaders, if you go away to fight, then there will be nobody there to protect your women and children. And North Carolina was interested in getting Catawba land. So those were kind of the dynamics of the time.
Now, the American Revolution and its war for independence didn't just divide and confront British Americans. It confronted and divided many Native American communities, too. Brooke, would you tell us how the American Revolution and Revolutionary War confronted the Catawba?
When the Catawbas first found out about the possibility of war, they were alarmed. They didn't understand why the English were going to war against one another, because on one side, they're negotiating deals being looked after by John Stewart, the superintendent of Southern Indian Affairs for the Crown. And on the other side are the Patriots, who are also their friends and neighbors. So they responded. Once they started hearing the rumor about war, they sent 2 runners to Charleston, which at the time was the capital of South Carolina. And they were to inquire why the English were preparing for war. So one of the councilmen, Colonel William Drayton Sr., he was a councilman for the South Carolina Council of Safety. He warned the 2 Catawba men. He said that the king has raised the cost of imported goods, and so they would have to start paying more in deer skins for the goods they wanted, and that the king wanted war. So Drayton, he also promised to pay the Catawbas for their military service. So for each Catawba that served, they were paid 10 pounds. So in October 1775 alone, 25 Catawbas served alongside Samuel Boykin, and they each received 10 pounds in payment for their service. So, like I've mentioned before, Catawbas were really friendly with most of their neighbors, and some of their neighbors were leaders or commanders of certain troops. This is the case, like I said, with Samuel Boykin. They rode with Boykin in 1775, and I believe they were under Sumter's main command.
Did the Catawba also seek to speak with Superintendent John Stuart or another British official to find out more about the causes of the revolution from the British perspective?
Yeah, that's initially where they heard the rumor from, was from John Stuart, because Stuart's home was in Charleston. And so as the war is starting to break out, he is exiled pretty much or run out of Charleston because he is a loyalist, of course. He's on the side of the crown. So that's where they first heard the rumor. And then they, they're smart leaders. They want to corroborate it with the South Carolina councilman.
So both the Revolutionaries and the British were seeking a military alliance with the Catawba. Why? What made the Catawba an ally that everyone wanted?
Yeah, and this goes back to Governor Glenn when he was governor of South Carolina and his need for the Catawbas to act as a buffer to the backcountry, and Catawba warriors protecting the English settlements near their towns. So in these years before the American Revolution, Catawbas had at least, on the low end, 11 enemies that were attacking them, raiding their towns from all sides. So this would have included Mohawk, Seneca, Shawnee, Delaware. And so what this did is it kind of created a siege mentality where warriors had to be constantly on alert, as did the women and children. So the warriors are, as these attacks recur over and over again, they're building up their skills, and they develop this reputation as being powerful, cunning, and skillful on the battlefield. And I think it was the Iroquois that even said that even after their death, their very bones shall fight. So that's just really, I think that's a wonderful image to show this military strength of the Catawba Indians, their might, their determination to survive.
Yeah, wow. These were people with strong military prowess that everyone wanted on their side. So when the Revolutionary War started, how did the Catawba make their decision to side with the revolutionaries? And did they ever consider siding with the British or even trying to remain neutral?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked about that, because it's difficult to say precisely how, when, or why Catawbas made their decision to ally themselves with the Patriots. It's because there's no written evidence to tell us about, say, for example, a council meeting that brings all the Catawbas together where they vote in consensus on business dealing with the tribe, and that would have included going to war. So we don't know a lot precisely about why they made the decision they did, but it could have been in part because of their decades-long animosity between the Iroquois and the Catawbas. That may have been a factor. But we should also keep in mind that Catawbas had aligned themselves with the Carolina colony many times before, and only in one instance were they in opposition to the colony, and that was the Yamasee War. And I think also because many of the Patriot leaders lived close to the nation, that as this friendship developed, Catawbas also felt some sort of loyalty to these men. So take, for example, Colonel Joseph Kershaw of Camden, South Carolina. He had a long-standing friendship with King Hagler, who was the Catawba leader, until 1763, so around the end of the French and Indian War. And they remained loyal friends until Hagler's death. And during the Second Cherokee War of 1776, during the American Revolution, Catawbas served as scout under Colonel Andrew Williamson. And he just lived a little to the west of Catawbas villages. But also, in the Southern campaign of the American Revolution, Catawbas are just too close to the action. There's no way that they could be neutral. And so I think the factors that they had been surrounded for decades when the American Revolution broke out, they decided to side with the rebels.
I wonder if we could talk about the Catawbas' contribution to the Revolutionaries' war effort. How many warriors did the Catawba send to fight alongside the Revolutionaries? And what was it like for the Catawba to fight alongside these Americans?
Most of the warriors already had experience in terms of native warfare, and they would serve in major battles in the Southern campaign, from the battle at Sullivan's Island in 1776 all the way up to the Battle of the Waxhaws, which was right at their back door. And that battle is also known as Tarleton's Massacre. So that was May 1780. So all these conflicts are taking place close to their towns, and they're riding along with revolutionary leaders, military leaders. They don't think of themselves as being under the command of, because they can get up and leave anytime they want. And that's much different than militias at the time. And the battle at Camden is going to be a really key event for Catawbas. And that battle took place in August of 1780. So as the British troops are getting closer into the back country, Catawbas sense the threat because they've already been engaged in many battles. And so they want to get their women and children and the elderly away. And so many of the men who are still young enough to be warriors and protectors, they escorted the women and children somewhere in Virginia. The thought is maybe they went to live with the Pamunkeys for about 6 to 9 months. And while the women and children and elderly were in Virginia, the warriors continued to participate in conflicts in Camden, Cowpens, and in Guilford County Courthouse in North Carolina. So when they return to their towns in April of 1781, they find their homes, their crops, all of it's destroyed. The homes have been burned down. The livestock was either killed or, stolen. And so all they knew was lost. And so they become dependent on South Carolina for corn during the winter of 1782 as they're trying to get themselves back on their feet. So this is some of the things that they're experiencing. It's really difficult for Catawbas during the war. And mostly the men, the warriors, they served as scouts because they know the lay of the land and they know the different routes in which to get to certain places that take place during the battles.
Would you tell us about the Catawba's service as scouts and the role scouting played in the war?
Well, for example, in the Cherokee War of 1776, Catawba served under Colonel Williamson, and they went ahead of the Revolutionary militia because the Army is going up into Cherokee middle towns and the lower towns. And so the Catawbas go ahead of them just to kind of see if the lay of the land is safe, if there are any Cherokee warriors out. They get there before Williamson and come back and tell him where the Cherokees are at. They tell him how many warriors are in the town. And then they go with Williamson and his troops and attack the towns. So they're heavily engaged in the battle, but they're also ahead of the troops scouting out the lay of the land.
Do we know how many Catawba would have served in a scouting party?
Well, we have one pay bill, which is where Catawbas were paid for their service. And it lists 25 Catawba men. And they received the 10 pounds for anywhere from 44 days service to 98 days service. And this was under Captain William Drennan, who was under Thomas Sumter. And that's really the only evidence that we have of how many. I think in the Cherokee War, if I remember correctly, that there were 40 Catawba Indians that went on that expedition.
You've mentioned the Cherokee War a few times. Would you tell us a bit more about it? Because it sounds like it was a war within the larger Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I mean, it was an important, significant part of the war because the Cherokees had aligned themselves with the British. And the Cherokee towns, the lower towns, were in South Carolina. So there was the concern by the officials in South Carolina that this would allow the British to take over that part of the colony. And so that's part of the reason why Williamson and his troops in the Catawba set out to go against the Cherokees. And when they get there, they completely destroy the Cherokee towns. So they end up in the same situation that the Catawbas did in 1780.
Now, what did the command structure look like when Williamson and the Catawba went out to attack the Cherokee? Because earlier you noted that the Catawba had their own commanders and could pretty much leave the army anytime they wanted to. So where did they fit into the command structure of the South Carolina Militia Service?
Well, they usually served alongside of a colonel that was under the command of Thomas Sumter. And the way that they distinguished themselves as different or loyal to the revolutionary cause was they wore deer tails on the tops of their heads. So if a Catawba warrior was approached by a revolutionary in the woods, this is one of the insignias that was used to show that you sided with the Patriots. And so in the Cherokee War, that's how Williamson's troops distinguished Catawba from Cherokee. But within Williamson's troops, like you were asking me about how did the Catawba serve alongside or under the Americans, it would have been like, so they would listen to the command or followed the command of Williamson. And then next in line would have been their leader, who was General New River. And New River and his war captain would have made the best decisions for their people, their warriors.
So it sounds like the Patriot militias decided what they needed to do, issued orders, and then the Catawba figured out how best to execute those orders, or even whether those orders were executable.
Right.
And you noted that both the War for Independence and the War with the Cherokee really took its toll on the Catawba people. And I wonder if you would tell us more about the cost of these wars for the Catawba.
In talking about the cost of the war for Catawbas, we also have to think about the war was for freedom and independence. So who does this independence go to? But for Catawbas specifically, the cost of war was one, when they returned back home in 1781, they had to rebuild their homes. They had to start crops all over again. And the Catawba population declines after the war. And because of this population decline, the Catawba Nation is less of a security threat for South Carolina. So South Carolina doesn't have to worry about a militant Catawba force turning on South Carolina. And the state just becomes less concerned about Catawba because the population is so low. Warriors, men who are used to showing their masculinity in warfare, no longer did they have an enemy to fight and no one to use their warrior skills on. So instead of doing that, some of them joined Wild West shows, and they traveled to the U.S. West, and some of them traveled to Europe, so London and Ireland. But also in this period, Catawbas are going to experience dramatic dispossession of their land. So shortly after the Revolution has ended, Catawbas start a land leasing system, and by 1790, most of their land, which was 15-mile square tract, most of that land they have leased to Anglo-American settlers. So people coming from western Pennsylvania, coming from Virginia and the coast of South Carolina, they're coming in to Catawba lands because they know they can rent a large parcel of land for a very small annual rent. So sometimes an individual, a landless settler, would come in and he would get upwards of 1,000 acres of land. And he only had to pay the Catawbas an average of $10 per year for all that acreage. And what this eventually does is a gradual process, but it leads to the loss of Catawba land to South Carolina with the Nation Ford Treaty in 1840. So Catawbas are left landless. They're wandering throughout South Carolina. A small group joins with the North Carolina Cherokee, and it's not until around 1850 that they return to their ancestral land, and they're able to settle on a small parcel of land, about 630 acres. And the population, it does rebound, but slowly.
It sounds like from our conversation that the Catawba didn't have a lot of choice about whether or not to participate in the Revolutionary War because the war was literally on their doorstep. Looking back with hindsight, is it possible to gauge the impact the Catawba had on the course of the war and whether the Catawba thought their participation was worth it?
I think if the Catawbas had not participated in the war, the Southern campaign would not have been as successful as it was. Or it would have been successful, but it would have taken a much longer time and resulted in higher loss of human life. Because Thomas Sumter, he relied on the Catawbas. He relied on being able to find refuge within their towns. And once he and his troops, his men were in the Catawba towns, the Catawbas fed them, took care of them. So instances like that, if Sumter hadn't had a refuge, a place to hide out, we can only guess at what the outcome may have been. Now, if we could go back in time and ask a Catawba, say, in 1790, do you think your participation in the war was worth it? There's no way to even guess at what they would say. I do know that by the early 1800s, some of the Catawba men are still wearing military coats that they wore during the Revolution. So that says to me that they were proud of their service, but they may not have been happy with the outcome for the Catawbas specifically.
The Catawba's position in the Carolina Piedmont, which stretched through the center of North Carolina down through the core of South Carolina, made neutrality an impossibility during the Revolutionary War. The war raged right through the heart of Catawba towns and lands, which meant the Catawba had to pick a side in order to defend their families. But just because they had to choose a side didn't mean they had to choose the revolutionary side. As Brooke revealed, it's impossible for us to know exactly why the Catawba chose to fight alongside the revolutionaries. Perhaps it was because many of their traditional enemies had chosen to fight alongside the British. Perhaps it was because they had a long history of allying with South Carolina. Or perhaps it was the fact that many of their white friends and neighbors had chosen to fight as revolutionaries. Regardless of the exact reasons why, it's clear that the Catawba chose to ally with the revolutionaries for reasons that mattered and made sense to them. And this is something that's been really interesting throughout our conversations with Fred, Randy, and Brooke, and also last week with Judy Van Buskirk in episode 157. All of the men who fought in the Revolutionary War, African Americans, Native Americans, and whites, all fought for similar personal reasons. Men chose to join the army to defend their families, to fight for a better future, because it offered money and adventure, and because their friends and family members had joined the army. It's also interesting to note that, regardless of the different reasons of why they chose to fight for the revolution, revolutionary soldiers all endured roughly similar experiences in their military lives. Life in the army was dangerous, often monotonous, and kept soldiers apart from their loved ones. From all of our conversations, it actually seems like the biggest differences in soldiers' experiences really came before and after their lives in the army or militia. African American veterans encountered an early republic that still supported slavery and racism and denied free black men the right to vote. Many Native Americans returned to their lands to find that the war had destroyed their towns and homes, and that new state governments stood poised to dispossess them of their lands, including those lands owned by people who had fought alongside the revolutionaries. And the post-war experience for white veterans varied. Some returned to a life similar to the one that they had had before the war. Others struggled to scrape by, while still others found that they could indeed create a better life. Was the sacrifice and hardship that all of these men and their families faced to affect the ideas and goals of the American Revolution worth it? As Brooke noted, it's hard to tell. For the individuals who served, it was a personal question with a personal answer. And for the new nation, well, it's been a question that Americans have been trying to answer ever since the revolution ended. It's a question they ask every time they try to further realize the revolution's promise of freedom and equality for all. Look for more information about our guests, their work, and notes from today's episode on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/158. This episode was made possible by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of the William & Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943. If you enjoy exploring the American Revolution, you should extend your journey by buying a copy of the William & Mary Quarterly's special joint issue about the American Revolution. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/WMQ promo to get your copy of this special issue for the listener-only discounted price of just $10. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Christopher Daly, who allowed me to use audio from his video of the 2017 reenactment of the Battle of Lexington Green, as well as to the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps for use of sections of their video Anniversary Sequence, which is where the drum beat and the music of the White Cockade came from. I've included links to both videos in the show notes. And as always, I'd like to thank the Omohundro Institute and the Doing History team for their support and assistance with this episode. Thanks, team! Finally, now that we've explored military aspects of the American Revolution, does it change how you think about or define the American Revolution? Let me know. Send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me, @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.